Hi and welcome. This is Leaving Babylon, and I'm Madeline. Today I'll be continuing the theme of surrounding the camp in part 2 of the series, and this one is called The Curious Georges. As I studied the topic of Gog Magog, or Gog Magog, over the last few years, a name continually cropped up, and it became impossible to unravel from the overall study of the final battle, or the final confrontation of the enemies of God against Jesus and the saints. So the camp of the saints is referenced in Revelation 20 and the beloved city. So I'm going to start with some scripture, and we're going to look at Ezekiel 38 verses 1 to 8. So Ezekiel is prophesying, "And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn thee back, and put hooks in thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all of his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. After many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them." And so I think there's a lot here. I just want to highlight that there are nations, plural, that are mentioned in this prophecy. And so I think that's really important to recognize, that there's a critical element here where Gog is actually referenced as the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And also, so that's an individual. And what I would say is that somebody with a title or a lineage that is going to be part of the end, as I like to call it, of the Revelation 20 prophecy. And so I think that, like here, we can see there's Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, and there's also Gomer and the house of Togarmah. And, so there's a number of groups of people, and I think these are what Revelation refers to, Revelation 20, the nations, Gog and Magog. And so when we're talking about this, it is going to be nations that come out of the four quarters of the earth. And it even talks here about, in the latter years, thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. And so it tells me that the latter years being the very end. And that's what I'm taking from it. Obviously, I'm not proposing to know what prophecy means in its entirety, but I think God gives us a reflection in the times in which we live. And that's an important thing to recognize. The Spirit of truth will tell us what the season is, and I think that's why many of us are here. We understand the season in which we live. So you'll notice my thumbnail for this video shows a number of Georges, and we'll be speaking to these. But just a lot of the symbology, which is to do with maritime, Freemasonry, and obviously some of the skull and bones, and then just war in general. So there's a cannon, and then there's some little airplanes there. So I want to start by just going back. So in the previous video, part 1 of this series, I talked about Prester John a little bit. I'm just going to minimize my window here. And I want to just revisit this king that was in the Byzantine era. And we're going to look at his story and some of the context around him a little bit more. And so we read out of the letter that he had written to someone called Emmanuel of Constantinople. And part of this said, "We have some people subject to us who feed on the flesh of men. When any of these people die, their friends and relations eat him ravenously, for they regard it as a main duty to munch human flesh. Their names are Gog, Magog, Ani, Agate, Azanak, Fomaperi, Befari, Coni, Semente, Agramandri, Vintefole, Casbe, and Alane. And these accursed 15 or 12 nations will burst forth from the four quarters of the earth at the end of the world and overrun all the abodes of the saints." Now it talks about them being overrun, where actually in Revelation 20 it says that they will be surrounded. So the camp of the saints will be surrounded. So there's a little bit of what I don't sometimes line up with scripture in these, but nonetheless, if it's a very old manuscript, sometimes these translations and also some of the context can be misinterpreted. So we're going to look a little bit more at Prester John. And I wanted to, this is from History Today. This is an article on Prester John. And it kind of talks through who this person was. And it sounds a little bit like he was, well, the story is he was ruling up in the region that had been the center of Christendom up in the northeast of Asia. And I'll show you a map in a minute as to where that was, but it was also in the same region of the Mongols. And Prester John and Chinggis Khan or Genghis Khan were actually alive at the same time, and they were kind of cohabitants of the land. And so the Christians and then what would have been a very strong contingent of the Muslims would have also been living in the same area. And so when I was reading up and taking notes on who Prester John was, it comes up that it seems to me like he may have actually been at the very end of or near the end of the millennial reign, and he seems to have lost some of his, maybe some of the original Christian values in the way that he was. And it's hard to say. I don't want to, cast aspersions on the person. It could also be that we're receiving the message out of, in kind of a skewed form. So, but here we find out that Marco Polo set out on his travels. So by the time Marco Polo was set out on his travels, the identification of Prester John with the ruler of the Curates had become generally accepted. And Polo's account of Prester, while similar to that of Rubric, makes no further mention of these people. But I wanted to go down, and he says here, Marco Polo is not greatly impressed with Prester's sanctity. He attributes the defeat of Prester John by Chinggis, which it goes into this story of astrologers, and Genghis Khan got his astrologers to find out whether he would win, and they told him that he would, and then so he went to battle, and apparently he beat Prester John. So it says here, Prester John Chinggis Khan beat Prester John in great part due to the king's pride and lack of tact in dealing with the Mongols. So this is the story we get, whether it's true or not, but I wanted to go down a little bit more, and it just tells us a little bit more about it. So the general trend of the Prester John legend, they still call him a myth and a legend, even though it seems like other people that they will verify as true, like Marco Polo and these people, have verified this person as existing, but never mind. So they the general trend of the Prester John legend in the 13th century was toward a discrediting of the priest king in favor of the Mongols. And so that's kind of how it goes. And then it says, his conquerors, on whose shoulders it seems had fallen the mantle of the saviors of Christendom. There was some basis to this concept. Several important Mongol officials were Christian, and several of the clans which had united under the banner of Chinggis Khan were of this faith. And it does seem to align with the Christianization of the world, particularly in North Asia, where that whole evangelization of the world really took off. And then as we go down, and I'm coming back to the George theme, so it turns out, there's this kind of back and forth between Islamic and Christian. And then if you go down further, it says here that Marco Polo found a person whom he considered to be descended from Prester John, and his name is George. And it says, who still ruled in the province of Tunduk, in the great loop of the Yellow River, where Polo had located the priest's realm. So it looks to me like this Marco Polo person wrote stories about looking for this Prester John's kingdom. And there's a lot of other information that goes along with that, including a very rare kind of stone that was found only in that region. And I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but it was like a blue stone, like very rare, very hard to find. But there was like this major vein that went through the earth that was just of this one particular stone substance. And so who knows, maybe they were looking for treasure as they were exploring and looking for these old kingdoms. However, it says here that George's family married into that of the great Khan. So that is just something to bear in mind, and I think, in my understanding, I think there is actually a connection between George and the end of the millennial reign and this kind of Khan dynasty. And we'll go into this a little bit more now. So let me go back to my pictures here. One of the things that I found is that the name George is actually etymologically Gog or Judge. So if you say George, you are practically saying Judge. And especially if you have an accent of any kind that blends the vowels a little bit more. So I would like to show you just a little bit of this. So out of the Greek, Georgios, the name derives from the ancient Greek, Georgios, and we're talking about Gog. So this is the name, and this is the background of it. So this name derives from the ancient Greek Georgios, from the element Georgios, tilling the ground, fertilizing, which in turn derives from Judge, land, earth, country, soil. And then it goes on to explain that a little bit more, and then it talks about famous Georges. And so I just wanted to highlight the connection of the name George to the name Gog. It is a one-to-one relationship. And another connection that we have actually is from the Eastern Orthodox, which I believe is in the very far east. I think that's where it all originates. We also get the story of George and the Dragon. Now, the very old Orthodox images show a rider on a white horse with a spear and a red robe and a saintly appearance. And so I think the original Saint George was actually probably a saint for real. However, as you move forward through history, you get more of like a Renaissance style. And I think there was like a co-opting of this saint. And I think it has to do with the name George. And I think, so originally St. George was known to Eastern Christians, but somehow he became the patron saint of England, Portugal, Catalonia, and Aragon. And there's actually an apocryphal hagiographic work that tells the story of St. John. It's called the Passio Georgi. And So you can go read that if you like. But allegedly, in the stories there's a few stories out there about St. George that get a little bit confused. And so there's one of the stories is that he was a saint who was martyred in the reign of Diocletian. And so he was adopted as a patron, but get this, he was adopted as the patron saint of the Order of the Garter. And so this is where these kind of secret societies start to blend in with what I think were probably original stories, but then they were co-opted. And so now this patron saint actually became the patron saint of, or the Order of the Garter, which is basically what all of the royal family would belong to. And I'm talking about the Windsors, the Habsburgs, and these families that are ruling the world right now. So I think it's fair to say that there has been some corruption in this story. And so as of Edward III, St. George was the patron saint, or so the patron of the Order of the Garter. And he was even called the jewel of the Order of the Garter. So there's something very significant about the name George. Judge, if we're going to use that reference to actually talk about this person as he's recognized in history. So I want to just quickly go back and show you the territories that we were talking about when it came to Prester John. And I've shown other pictures with little flags in it showing the amount of Christianity that had been the saturation of Christianity in the Northeast. And this area in particular, called Tenduk, was the realm of where Prester John was located. And you can even see there were castles in that area. And even more so, you can see that this actually talks about the Christian sort of region that it was. And not far from there, we actually have Tartar, and we have a number of other references that we would recognize here, like the Mongol, and that would be Genghis Khan's area there. And so he was from that kind of more Tartar area, and then this area here was Prester John's area. And then another map that we can look at here is a little bit more detailed, but you can see that Tenduk is this region here, and a little bit further, sorry, it says Tenduk there, but it's actually up here. And then you can see Magog right there. And this is all scriptural. You know, there's no getting away from it that this area is steeped in the actual history of Scripture. There's Mongol there, yeah. And so here, even if you zoom in closely, it talks about Paul. And I've said before that I think it's possible that they use Marco Polo as a cover story for M. Paul, which I think could be Master Paul, Saint Paul. And I think that's very possible. But Tenduk, you can see there's an actual castle there too. And then right below that, Tartarorum. Okay, so these things are all very close together, Tartar. And I have brought up in the last video and other videos that Tartarus was the other name for hell. And I think that's very valid. The other thing I want to mention again is just the pronunciation of Gog or Gog Magog. And this is how you would find it in the Arabic. It says Islamic, but I prefer to say Arabic. Yajuj and Majuj. And I think these are actually, they borrow eschatology from Christianity. And this is kind of what we're looking at when they drew pictures of all of this. But again, I think this is from the Asia region. So going back to St. George, the Order of the Garter it was founded by Edward III in 1348. So if we're talking about this person that was found, this George person that was found over in the region of Prester John, and his name was George, and all of this kind of came about around the same time. I wonder how much of the time period, and again, if you compress 700 years, that might not have actually been that long ago. If we just go back a couple of hundred years, it might have even been around that time. So I'm trying to give sort of an insight into the stories, but also open up what the timeline might look like so that we can feel a little bit more comfortable with adjusting our perception of what exploration and discovery would have looked like. It probably not that long ago. I mean, giants were not alive that long ago. I mean, they were alive not that long ago. So, I think we just have to be a little bit more flexible in our understanding of time and how much the timeline has been stretched to make it seem longer than it actually is. And so I think a lot of these early, let's say, early 1800s, late 1700s, where we have people trying to find the Northwest Passage, for example, exploring the Arctic, that might have been right around the same time as something like this. You see what I'm saying? You can stretch time by adding a lot of different, let's say, popes and kings and queens, and you can really open it up, and all you have to do is write about it, right? So I think my perception is that we can just be open to seeing that a little bit more. So king attends first order of the Garter service. So this is what they look like when they're doing this order of the Garter thing, and who knows what it all really means, right? But I think it's possible that these people, they practice a kind of, they practice different personas in order to woo the public into their characters, into who they are. And they take on this kind of red cross of St. George, and they take on all of this regalia to kind of hypnotize people. You kind of think these people are really important most of the time because they wear all these outfits and they do all these like big ceremonies and things. So as part of this Order of the Garter service, they go to somewhere, obviously. They do a procession to St. George's Chapel. St. George's Chapel is a place of worship for the Queen and the royal family, as well as the church serving the local community. And this is just what it looks like, I guess, from underneath. So this would be the roof. The construction of the chapel was begun in 1475 by Edward IV and completed by Henry VIII in 1527. I mean, who knows if any of these dates are actually true, right? It says the architecture represents one of the finest examples of perpendicular Gothic style in the country. And it is really neat. Like, I do like these old buildings. They are fascinating. But I would have liked to see what the original people who built them and who purposed them for true worship actually looked like, and kind of what those practices would have been like. But these days, they've got Masonic flooring, and they really use them for their own empire building, don't they? And all of these so-called royals definitely just use the old buildings for their own processions and their own glory. There's something else about St. George is there is another story about the slaying of a dragon, and it comes from the Hittites, actually. So in Hittite mythology, Aluyanka was a serpent dragon slain by Tarhuns, the Hittite incarnation of the Hurrian god of sky and storm. It is known from Hittite cuneiform tablets found at Qorum, Bogoskoi, the former Hittite capital, Hattusa. The contest is a ritual of the Haitian Spring Festival of Puruli. And I just was calling out here that this myth belonged to the Hittites, which I think would have been older, technically speaking, than the St. George myth. So this whole concept of St. George slaying a dragon, what are they actually trying to personify there? Some kind of, well, if the person was actually a saint, but then they're taking this myth, because the Bible speaks nothing about any of the saints or even the Archangel Michael slaying the dragon. It talks about the dragon being bound and put into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. And so that's why, and then being thrown into the lake of fire at the end. And I think that's why it's a little bit confusing, but it must mean something to these people that they have to adopt this myth into the St. George story. Another story that comes from myth and legend is that of Cadmus, who also allegedly killed a dragon, and he buried the teeth of the dragon, and from the teeth grew a race of warriors called the Spartoi. And I find that story also interesting on another level, in just the sense that if you had teeth of dragons or giants, in today's world, you could, and probably back then at some point, you could genetically replicate from those genetics probably a person or a type of person, right? A type of, let's say Gog Magog. You could recreate these people. And so I don't know if that's what that's alluding to, but either way, there are a lot of Georges, and I'm just going to go through these a little bit. So George the First was really the first of the, let's call them the great Georges after St. George, I would say. And something that I think is really important to recognize is that in all that we have seen, the name George carries with it a kind of significance. And I'll get into that a little bit more when I get into some of the other Georges, but here briefly we can see George the First, George the Sixth, George the Fifth, and the two George Bushes, Senior and Junior, George Soros, and then Prince George, George Orwell, and George Floyd. And I think we can all agree all of these Georges have had a significant impact on the agenda of the enemy. And that is, other than maybe Prince George, who's still a bit young, but obviously he's being raised, and his training will be in line with all of these other Georges. That is what these people are born to do. And it is my belief that this system is calling out Gog Magog. It is actually like the name of Gog Magog. It is all the nations that belong to Gog Magog. And these people have been raised, and they have had all the training to continue to progress that agenda. And so, let's look at George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr., both very, very critical individuals in the more modern rollout of what I would call the New World Order, what they call the New World Order, actually, not me. And, they hailed that many times, not just in their speeches, but in the things that happened during their office, their time in office, and many of the things that they did and said. And not just that, but George and the two Georges Bush family were called Gog and Magog. So I think there's a lot of evidence to show that these people belong to that same group. And so the name George was rarely used in England until German-born George the First. I'll just go back to him there for a minute. So he's down on the left-hand corner. So yeah, he came from Germany actually, and he came to the British throne after he was already on the German throne. He was of the House of Hanover, so he was actually born in 1660, and he was born in Germany. He was the ruler of Hanover, and so he later became the King of Britain and Ireland, which I think were two separate kingdoms at the time. And he was also a Knight of the Garter. And so in 1714, King George the First of the House of Hanover became King of Great Britain and Ireland. That's when he became. He was also involved in the Jacobite Rebellion in 1746. He was supporting the return of James, I think it was, James the Seventh to the throne of Great Britain. And then, so that's kind of just a background of him. But he's the one actually who, if you go back all the way through the lineage, like we have done in another video, you can see that his lineage goes all the way back, at least in official kind of their documentation, their lineage that they track would be all the way back to the likes of Enki and Enlil. They actually believe that they come from gods. And some of us might actually believe that they come from an unholy union. And here is King George III. Now, the reason King George III plays a part in this Gog Magog surrounding of the camp story is that he was the ruler, the king at the time of American independence, and so he became the pantomime baddie. And what I find interesting is a lot of these people don't even look the same in other... I mean, he actually looks quite a lot the same in some of these. But maybe they made him look bad because he was actually the pantomime baddie. But here we have a PBS. I found that on the PBS website, and here the National Portrait Gallery, and then over here Wikipedia has him looking like that. So he could be a general, he could be a king, he could just be kind of a nobleman, I guess. And but ultimately he was enemy number one during the independence movement of the colonies, the 13 colonies. And so it was all around the taxation piece, and they created this scenario, which I would call Hegelian dialectic. And so you have your enemy on one side of the ocean. Literally, it's this kind of dualistic format. So you have George on that side, and then you have George on the other side, right? George Washington. So King George III was the British monarch from 1760 up until his death in 1820. King George III is best remembered for both leading England to victory in the 7 Years' War while also losing the American colonies following the American Revolution. And as many of us have realized, a lot of the stories that go along with these narratives are fabricated because they actually need the consent of the people. And here we have the two Georges. We have King George III and George Washington. And it reminds me a little bit of the current day Trump versus whoever, might be Zelensky or Putin or whoever it might be on any given day. But if you can set up a dialectic, you can actually get people to play along because people's emotions get involved when you're doing theater. That's the whole purpose of theater. So here from George Hegel, believe it or not, his name was also George. Dialectic is here understood in the grasping of opposites, in their unity, or of the positive in the negative. And, when you set up these two forces that are going to clash, it's like a sport. People get involved. I think there's something almost irresistible about taking a side, and finding a moral high ground because you're on a particular side. And that is the ultimate dialectic. We call it the Hegelian dialectic for the very reason here is that he kind of developed this strategy for politicians and whoever to use this method of coercion. So you don't know you're being coerced because your feelings are being engaged. Your emotions are being played, basically. It's a very manipulative and coercive method, but they've used it to actually get to their next levels. So each step you have to bring the herd along with you. And the only way to bring the herd along is if you lure them and you coax them. You know, you get your two dogs running either side and you're going to go that way and then you're going to go that way. And this is just how it plays out. You know, they understand human emotion and psychology. And so here is George Washington looking very dapper and kind of different than what I've seen him depicted as, but always, you know, the hand inside the jacket, the hidden hand. And going back to the theme of surrounding the camp, I believe that these Georges, or Gogs, the people of Gog and Magog, were always taking the next step. They were taking people and the nations to the next step, because this is part of the whole surrounding of the camp. And I just find it interesting to see how many different depictions of one person you can have. So from National Geographic, you have this him looking like that. And also from National Geographic, he's kind of looking like that. And he seemed to have a really long neck for some reason and a smaller head. But anyway. And this one is from Virginia Museum of History and Culture. So these are kind of just examples of what I think we get bombarded with. And when you have so many people in history as well, and I mean, it doesn't even really matter what people looked like back then. All it really matters is what they did, right? But they should be definable, at least discernible by their face, I think. And here is more political theater. So they're pretending they're all on opposing sides, or they're pretending like this is your, I guess, modern day Zelensky or Trump or whoever it might be. And they have to convince the other side. So the Hegelian dialectic is actually at play here as well. And just to go back. So I found this article here, which I thought was also really interesting. George Washington, the first and one of the greatest presidents of America, believed in giants. Okay, so here again, the theme of Gog and Magog, which was including giant races or giant nations, is now being mentioned. And I think it's I've seen this elsewhere, is that George Washington actually believed in giants. Okay, and so if we're talking about people that are bringing mankind into this kind of full-on assault against the saints and Jesus, this is where they come from. These are the people that they are. So that once upon a time there were giant human beings, tall as 4-story buildings, who roamed the earth. But it is not at all surprising. Every person living in the 1700s believed in giants. Well, imagine that. Because the huge skeletons of dinosaurs. This is a funny article because she, the writer thinks that dinosaurs exist. But anyway, so she's kind of flipping it. She's saying it was actually dinosaur bones, but people back then knew what human bones looked like. So estimated to be about 30 to 40 feet. Discovered in the 1600s were misinterpreted. I don't think they were misinterpreted as giant humans who once lived on the earth. And she kind of just goes on to talk about giants, but I think that's just kind of confirmation, you might say, that not only George Washington believed in giants, but most people in the 1700s believed in giants. And here we have the famous picture of George Washington there in the Capitol building. And it actually says here that they base this enthroned Washington on Phidias' statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which was destroyed in late antiquity. So this is a return of idolatry, but it's also the apotheosis sort of process where they believe that man would become divine. And obviously these people believed they already had some kind of divinity in them. And then there's the other aspect to this, which many of us know, is the as above, so below of the Baphomet culture, occult. And so, yeah, I think there's just a lot to be said there. And the ultimate aim of these people is what they would call freedom or liberty. And as we discussed before, that is a liberty to sin. And ultimately they want so-called freedom, but they want freedom from the laws of God. And that is the ultimate aim, just as they did in Babel. So Nimrod had convinced the people that they were working for freedom from God, and who they call the demiurge, their mortal enemy, because he has rules and he doesn't want them to be broken. Which is interesting. But the other thing I wanted to just call out here too is that George Washington had this lineage that was connected back to the supposed gods of the ancient, first people. And we would call that, I guess, unholy union. Some people would call that. And, Alexander the Great had a very similar story. And his mother was apparently, according to myth anyway, impregnated by Zeus. And Alexander the Great allegedly had horns, this kind of two-horned, they call him the two-horned one. And then we also have legend in the Tartaria region, and I would call that also the Mongol region of northern China and modern-day eastern Russia, of the Baphomet, and that is actually Mahomet, which is the Islamic founder. So something that I think many of us are realizing, at least I see this in a lot of places, is that modern day, what we're realizing is that the Great Deception is pretty much summed up in a statement that all the world's a stage. And that was written by William Shakespeare, famously. And, these people that parade on camera, if you can imagine, television is now modern day theater. That is where theater happens, right in your house, or right on your phone, or right on your computer. And it could be anywhere you go, there's TVs showing you what's happening on the stage. Well, who are the people that manage, that are really adept on the stage? They're actors. These people have Hollywood stars. They are, by oath, actually part of the system. And I would call it the Gog Magog system. I would call Freemasonry very, very connected to Gog Magog. I think it's irrefutable that the nations of the world are gathering more and more and more people under this banner of occult, sort of secret society, mystery religion. And then they have the people that kind of entertain you on the front of the stage. And they say things like, you must vote. And you're so privileged to be able to vote for us, or for who your candidate is. Well, they're never your candidate, are they? These are always people that they've selected. And it is a big chessboard. The president is just somebody who's been given a role to play on the stage, and they are sometimes playing the white piece and sometimes they're playing the black piece. It depends who they're on the stage with at the time. And ultimately, they need our consent to be there. And you're kind of like, bred in circuses. You're in the Colosseum and you are giving your thumbs up or your thumbs down for the last guy that was just on, And this is why they have to fight so hard for your ballot. And here's a little bit of theater happening. So we know that, I guess in about 2001, around about the 9th month of the calendar year, on the 11th day, there was an event that happened, and it was actually a big, massive psyop. And this is part of the theater. This person is an actor. You know, they were filming at this very moment. This is the stage, and this is what the person was doing. And I think there's something too about red ties, blue ties, and maybe there's certain ties that are like a mixture of red and blue. And I don't know what the meaning of that is, but I think it's important to recognize that all of this is carried out on camera for the film, so that people will be drawn into the story of what they're trying to depict. And we even have George W. Bush Jr. say Gog and Magog are at work in the Middle East. So this is where they try and elaborate or co-opt the story of Gog and Magog. They know it exists. You see, they know, this is their admission. We know this exists, but we're going to confuse you by starting to talk about it ourselves. And he wrote about the Middle East at the time that the biblical prophecies are being fulfilled. This confrontation is willed by God, who wants to use this conflict to erase his people's enemies before a new age begins. Right? So what's he saying here? He's basically promoting the new age that they're going to be bringing in. He is admitting that Gog and Magog are at work, okay? He is admitting biblical prophecies are being fulfilled. And he's talking about a confrontation. And yes, you know, in a sense, God is willing this confrontation. God will, you know, Gog and Magog will actually confront the beloved city. But the way that they phrase it and the things that they say are really to promote their own narrative in the minds of the people. So they show things on TV, and then they say things like this, and then people understand it in a way that might not actually be correct, and that is the magic. That is the spell. And so another George that I want to make sure we talk about is George Vancouver, because this man was actually very influential in what they say would be the survey of the Pacific region, and probably other places too, but in particular, as you can tell by his name, he was a pivotal explorer. I don't know if that's what he was actually called, but he was a captain, so Captain George Vancouver. And again, he looks very different in every depiction of him. I think this one in the middle is the most common of the depictions. But George Vancouver is a fascinating individual because they give him credit. Okay, so there's something here about surveying a certain area, and then because you've surveyed it, it now becomes kind of this contested land. And that's what happened on the west coast of Canada, and also down the west coast of the United States, all the way to, I think it might have been Mexico, maybe even further down. But there is a Vancouver, Washington, in Washington State as well. So this individual was very influential in really making what was, I guess, in historical record, a Spanish area on the west coast. If you go on the coast here, a lot of the islands have Spanish names. So you'll have the San Juan Islands, and you'll have the Juan de Fuca Strait, and you have Quadra, and all of these names were originally Spanish. So what George Vancouver kind of was instrumental in was turning the land over to the British rule, and that's why Western Canada is called British Columbia. And here on the Legislative Assembly of the capital of British Columbia is George Vancouver, allegedly, George Vancouver's statue on the top. Now, I question whether a lot of these or any of these Georges even existed. This is my underlying suspicion, is that I wonder if they even existed, or if they just needed names to do the thing so that they could get the land and they could sign the papers over. You know what I mean? Like, did these people actually do all of this? Were these people needed to record history and to document ownership of land? I kind of don't think they were even needed to do all of this. I could be wrong, but I feel like these people are given such godlike status that they almost exist outside of time and reality. Anyway, George Vancouver surveyed the northwest coast and also the west coast, and then British Columbia. So the name Columbia is synonymous with the New World, and that's why Columbia was the personification, actually, of America. And so here we can see that it was not until 1775, when the Revolutionary War broke out, that African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley made a reference to Columbia in a letter to George Washington. So apparently this was the first time in writing that the name Columbia was kind of brought to the attention of people through this letter, allegedly, to George Washington. And it kind of just, I'll read a little bit of it here. It says, "One century scarce performed its destined round, when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails." And, you know, Columbia is very much like Britannia. There's female, I would call them deities. It might even be the personification of Lilith. And, you know, I think that this entity just represents different nations under the Liberty cult. And you even see that Columbia wears Liberty Phrygian cap. And so, you know, it's just emblazoned over all of the old artwork and demonstrations, even this Columbia character, which, you know, is very spiritual in my view and very occultic. Something else that I would like to just point to is the north. So part of the story that we're kind of building here is the surrounding of the camp. And I just want to point out some of these things that I find along the way. And so just jumping a little bit to the surrounding of the camp theme, which I think can be reflected in a lot of the infrastructure that they have built everywhere. Like, okay, so this would be what they call a gas drilling project, but they've called it Liberty. And if you're like me and you believe that the Camp of the Saints is probably perfectly north from that drilling spot, which is right around Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, if you went to the extreme north from there, in my view, you would actually come to what I would think would be the Camp of the Saints, the Rupus Nigerus, and the land that is up there. And so why would you call your name Liberty Drilling Project? It's just really interesting. I think it's owned by BP Gas and Oil. And then this also fits in with the overall theming of the New World that they were building and designing. I mean, they didn't do a very good job because they actually tore down all the really nice stuff that was here before. So just an example here of the World's Columbian Exposition, 1893 in Chicago. You know, I think it's incredibly tragic to realize that the standards of these people are so incredibly low that they don't realize that everything they've torn down in their desire for this so-called freedom and so-called liberty is that they would remove the amazing structures that I believe were left behind, or they would tarnish them, they would blow them up, and they would pack them off and crush everything, just so that they could have their own kingdom, albeit for a little season. This is not a long time we're talking about. But I also think when I look at these things, I look at evidence of what I believe that God has in store for his people. So it is encouraging in a way. Very sad that they tore it down, but also very encouraging. And I'm sure if you're like me, you look forward to Jesus wrapping all this up. I sure do. So I found this really interesting article that links George W. Bush to the Gog Magog story. And it says here that obviously in the whole following years after the 2001 event, one of Bush's arguments in particularly rubbed Chirac, who was the Prime Minister of France, the wrong way. War is inevitable, Bush says, because prophecy is being fulfilled. He explicitly referred to Gog Magog, evil empires from the Old Testament. Okay. And of course they had this phone call where this whole thing is spoken of, and they're always pulling on the religious, the Christian narrative, the biblical narrative. Why are they doing this? If there was nothing to it, why would they do this, right? And we've seen this in the last video. We saw this picture here of the map, and it even references it here. And it just says Gog Magog in this map is like a badly written action thriller. And, you can even see this old map. So Jesus is in the paradise in India, it says there. And it says here that Gog Magog occur in Genesis and in particular in two very obscure chapters in Ezekiel. Obscure because, they don't want to be too open about who they are. It speculates on the future in a cryptic code that is intended for insiders, right? But interestingly, this article continues to kind of pull down on, the thread. And it talks about the axis of evil coming out of the nations of the north, led by Gog or George, the relation with Magog. And I think Magog actually means the son of or the relation of. And so it's a little bit like McGregor, that sort of McGregor type effect. And I think that is connected to Gog Magog. And so it could be Gog Magog, land of, the Prince of Magog. These are names that are difficult to decode because you need the Holy Spirit to actually decode them. And I think even secular writers can look at this and think, there's something there probably. And that's just talking a little bit more about that. So I want to just refer to this article here. This is a CNN article, and something I found really, I just kind of came across it weirdly as I was reading about things. And it was this article here. And so Bush says regarding Clinton relationship, I'm tired of the guy lying and ducking on the draft and not coming clean. So we've got to press him without trying to demagogue the issue. Now I know that's a word, don't get me wrong. Okay, but it just kind of stood out to me that they would use this language. And so I wanted to jump over and just look at that for a minute, because often we don't realize, but how things are said actually are related to each other, even if our understanding of the definition might seem unrelated. So this is just a little thread I went down, but demagogue sounds exactly like demagogue, right? And so a demagogue is a popular leader, a mob leader from the ancient Greek. People, populace, and leading, guiding, a rabble rouser, a political leader in a democracy who gains popularity by arousing the common people against elites, especially through oratory that whips up the passions of the crowd. Appealing to emotion by scapegoating outgroups, exaggerating dangers to stoke fears, lying for emotional effect, or other rhetoric that tends to drown out reasoned deliberation and encourage fanatical popularity. Demagogues overturn established norms and political conduct, or promise or threaten to do so. So a demagogue is a politician skilled in oratory, flattery, and invective, evasive in discussing vital issues, promising everything to everybody, appealing to the passions rather than the reason of the public, and arousing racial, religious, and class prejudices. A man whose lust for power without recourse to principle leads him to seek to become a master of the masses. He has for centuries practiced his profession of man of the people. He is a product of a political tradition nearly as old as Western civilization itself. I mean, you might want to go read this. And I know, I'm familiar with the word and in kind of reading it. But when you're in this conversation about Gog Magog, about the leaders, political leaders of democratic society, and you start putting them together, I just wonder if demagogue is actually related to Gog Magog. And I haven't gone down that far down the investigation, but I would not be surprised at all. So that would be an interesting one to look into. But just going back to the Arctic theme for a minute. So the other thing that the Bush administration did was Bush signed, and this is actually from 2009, new Arctic policies outlining U.S. intentions in the North. So a new United States policy in the Arctic is a powerful challenge for Canadians to establish their control over the area before the Americans do it for them. So we're going back quite a while here in terms of this Arctic policy and kind of these eyes on the North, right? It says here, freedom of the seas is a top national priority. The Northwest Passage is a strait used for international navigation. And again, so now, with, I guess, the move of interest in Greenland and the North by Trump and his buddy Musk, we could see how this actually was kind of being talked about for a long time by a number of different presidents. And here, 1984, statement on signing the bill amending the Arctic Research and Policy Act of 1984, sorry. So that's in 1990. And so that's just something, so it's always been something that they have been looking to do. And I would promote the idea that this is not related to trade particularly. I think this is more to do with the Gog Magog surrounding of the Camp of the Saints and the Beloved City. And then we also have this drilling controversy, so they call it Arctic Refuge. And the question of whether to drill for oil in the Arctic has been an ongoing controversy in the United States since 1977. Republicans have attempted to allow drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so here on the map here, you can see where that is. And that's in the Prudhoe Bay area, right? So I just showed you that Liberty drilling project is right in that area, 1002. And the wilderness area is right below it. So just kind of interesting to see how they've been having these conversations about certain areas of the North. And, how this could affect wildlife and things like that. And honestly, I don't think they care about wildlife. They don't even care really too much about people. So, but that's all I really had today. And so just finishing up, I want to say that I try to demonstrate that the Gog Magog story is very connected to the name George. And the Georges that we see throughout the history of the name George, starting with St. George and George, the relation of John Prester, up in that region of the Northeast, which is where Gog Magog actually were based and originated from. We now have these Georges that have continually become leaders of democracy, or this kind of liberty cult freedom movement that has usurped in the hearts of mankind, has usurped the freedom that is found in Christ. And so I would say that these people have had eyes on surrounding the camp. I think they are instrumental in writing treaties and continually pushing the next level of public consent, or consent of the governed. That's kind of their theater, is pushing along the people into the next level of consent. And it's like a slow boil over a while, over the little season, to herd everyone into a position of actual rejection of Jesus Christ, and then into a kind of aggressive confrontation with the king and the saints. And I hope that the church is with the saints by then. I hope that the modern church is actually in the camp of the saints and with Jesus by the time that this all comes into kind of a culmination. So I wanted to thank you for watching this. It was probably a bit of an odd inclusion in the story, but I hope it makes sense, and I hope it adds to a broader understanding of the people at play within this group of Gog Magog, Gog Magog, and George, son of George, all of these personas that have been playing out, including George Washington, George III, George Vancouver, and all of the other Georges that have influenced us, including the Bushes, who are also part of the Skull and Bones Society. So I think we can safely say that these famous Georges have been hand-selected, probably bred and trained specifically for the Gog Magog final battle. That would be my perspective on this, especially this video here. So I will be doing another one very shortly, and I thank you for watching. Take care. I'll see you next time. Bye.